Good morning to those who have just joined us. We're going to give it just one more minute for other folks to trickle in, and then we will get started. Thanks for your patience. All right, it looks like our new participants have slowed down, so we will go ahead and get started. Thanks all for joining us today for the third of 4 workshops on stakeholder engagement processes for the regional organization. We'll be together today for about 2.5 hours, and I know it's a long stretch, but we'll get a break in the middle, so appreciate y'all's active participation. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is the third of 4 workshops. We've gone through 2. After today's workshop, I know we've been on pretty breakneck pace, meeting every 1 to 1.5 weeks. So after today, we do get a little bit of a break. There'll be an opportunity for folks to provide comment on the topics covered in workshops 1 through 3. And in the meantime, your stakeholder process work group will be hard at work drafting a draft stakeholder engagement straw proposal. And so we'll come back to review that together on August 28th. So you get a whole, looks like just about a whole 4 weeks without me. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're together today for about 2.5 hours. Our agenda flow is very similar to our meeting last week, workshop 2, if you were there. We'll start out with our general housekeeping, and then similar to last time, there'll be some launch committee and stakeholder process work group members on a panel discussing the workshop 3 topic, facilitated by Pam. We'll go into a 10-minute break to give everyone a chance to regroup. And then the latter half of the workshop is focused on y'all's input on this workshop 3 topic. And then, of course, we'll save a few minutes at the end to make sure everyone knows what comes next. And so before we get into the our content today, I just want to call in some new faces to introduce themselves. If you are a member of either the launch committee or the stakeholder process work group, I invite you to raise your hand. And also, if you think you're going to have lots to say today about our workshop topic, please raise your hand as well. And if you haven't had a chance to introduce yourself or participate before. So I will model our introductions. My name is Neha. I am a director at GridWorks. I don't have a sector affiliation because I'm not part of the Pathways Project. And my icebreaker question for today is, what was your favorite summer job as a teenager? My favorite was actually my very first job. I got to be a swim instructor. Let's see, Allie, I don't think we've had you introduce yourself before.
All right. Yeah, good morning. I'm Allie Mace. I'm with Bonneville Power Administration. We are in the power marketing administration sector. And my favorite summer job, I used to teach horseback riding during the summer and taught at camp once. And that was super fun. Got to be outside a lot and working with kids. So that
cool.
would be my favorite.
Thanks, Allie. Carl Linville.
Hi, I'm Carl Linville. I work with the regulators. I work for a regulatory assistance project, and my role here is primarily to help regulators in their participation in this process. And I'm on the stakeholder group. My favorite summer job, the one that's coming to mind, it was working at a bookstore. It was just a lot of fun. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. We'll go to Walter.
Folks, thanks. This is Josh Walter. I'm with Seattle City Light. I am a sector liaison for the RIF, representing the EIM entity sector. I'm also a launch committee member representing the public power sector, so kind of bridging between two different sectors in two different capacities. Also member of the or participating in the stakeholder working group. My favorite job growing up was dragging and chalking baseball and softball fields. It was an awesome summer job as a high school kid, just driving around in a truck on baseball fields, you know, making all the beer league softball players happy for straight white lines.
Great. Thanks, Walter. I'm sensing a theme that we all wish we were outside a little bit more. Maybe except for Carl, who is very happy in the bookstore. Karen.
Hey folks, this is Karan Pol. I represent Daymark Energy Advisors, who has been representing SEBA in the Markets Plus stakeholder process. In terms of a favorite summer job, babysitting has to take the cake. You get to catch up on a lot of Netflix. Thanks.
Thanks, Karan. Apologies for mispronouncing. Ian.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Ian White with Shell Energy here. And I look after our Western regulatory policy for Shell Energy and in the Western US. So sector affiliation would be sort of IPPs and marketer is how we slice and dice ourselves. Although we do have a retail load serving entity as well. So a little bit hard to categorize in that regard. And favorite summer job, I think when I worked at the last full service gas station in the town I grew up in. So I washed a lot of windshields and checked tires and pumped gas, which was a good one. Thanks.
Nice. Thanks, Ian. We'll go to Kirsten. I
Hi.
apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly.
You're all good. Kirsten Rock with Pacific Core. I oversee here their policy and analytics. I also am their EDAM implementation lead. I am a member of the Pathways and in the IOU sector. And while I'm not normally on this subcommittee, I am involved in the CAISO's issue committee. I'm here today because my colleague Mike Wilding is off, so I wanted to provide some coverage. Favorite summer job? Probably when we worked in an Italian restaurant in Austria when I was about 16 and had to learn how to make tiramisu and all these incredibly gluttonous and delicious foods. And somehow I just realized we were also able to serve beer in the beer garden. And we're very proud when we could figure out how to carry so many steins of beer. But apparently different rules apply there. So for youth and alcohol. So anyway, nice to meet you all.
Thanks so much. We'll do just a few more. Can we have Alan go?
Hi, Alan Meck, PG&E. I am I am one of our CAISO policy leads. Yeah, not much to say on that. Favorite summer job when I was a teenager is probably being a bridge caddy. So if you guys are familiar with the card game Bridge, that is generally played by retired folks. Well, my mom was like probably the youngest player in all of Southern California playing, and so she would get me these jobs at tournaments because I guess old people can't be trusted to like swap boards with each other because the idea is like you have to play one board and then like your partners at like the other table have to play the same board and like you compare against like who did the best with like each hand and stuff. And so like they need a neutral person, generally like some kid or something they hire for like a couple bucks here and there. And so yeah, it was an interesting job, but a good way to make a significant amount of cash for the time I started was when I was like 7 or 8 years old. Like $200 in a weekend.
Oh, wow. Okay. Here I am like vacuuming the house for $5.
Yeah, it was good bucks back in the 90s.
Yeah. I was doing the wrong thing. Let's do a couple more. Alicia.
Hey, good morning. My name's Alicia Vinoy, and I represent Renew Home as the Regulatory Affairs Manager. And we are technically in the IPP sector in the RIF. However, we are a wholesale market integrated demand response provider, as well as providing utility integrated demand response. My favorite summer job as a teenager would have to be being a lifeguard at a private community pool, because some days there was just nobody at the pool. So I was just hanging out poolside, enjoying it myself. So pretty fun. Although I will say that the sun damage, I'm starting to notice some of that now. So wear your sunscreen.
Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, I feel the same from all my summers teaching swim lessons. Let's see. Eli, I'll have you go live, and then Kathleen and James, if you want to do introductions and favorite summer jobs in the chat, so we can get started on our content.
Howdy, everybody. I'm Eli. I'm a Department of Energy fellow, sort of nominally serving as energy liaison with the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. So hard to pin down my sector. Some of our tribes operate utilities, but I don't work for them directly. I work for AT&I, which is an intertribal organization, really just here to follow along and see how things are developing. My favorite summer job as a kid was probably just landscaping. I think it was pretty easy money at the time. I didn't work many hours, so I enjoyed that a lot. And then later, probably I'll just stick with landscaping. Landscaping was wicked fun.
Thanks so much, Eli. All right. Really appreciated hearing about all of those. Sometimes I wish maybe that's what I was doing with my summer, but here we are at the Stakeholder Process Working Group meeting, which is everyone's current favorite summer job. Can I get the next slide, please? All right, so just wanted to share a little bit of what we heard from y'all in workshop 2 before we move into our new topic. So as a reminder, our topic last time was about different methods of stakeholder engagement. And so what we heard a lot about Markets Plus and CAISO, but also as our conversation continued, we were able to bring in some perspectives from stakeholder engagement processes outside of those two, particularly PJM. Oh, thanks, Sarah. It seems like there's support for CAISO's Regional Issues Forum and appreciation for recent efforts from the CAISO to update their processes, including the roundtable. However, some processes seem too open-ended and take too long to resolve issues or develop recommendations. So there's a desire for a little bit more formality, but also not too formal. An interesting idea was brought up, exploring maybe a dual structure that balances stakeholder and staff roles in introducing and managing new policy initiatives. Folks wanted the folks who were putting together this straw proposal to be sure to consider market differences in picking elements of other stakeholder engagement models. And then finally, not every issue might require a robust stakeholder staff process. So it's important to be clear about what topics require something really robust and what topics maybe can be handled with something slightly less robust. Next slide, please. So in our last workshop, we also offered a starting point for what is our overall goal and objectives for a stakeholder engagement process for the eventual regional organization. We heard some feedback from y'all last time and went back and made a couple of modifications to our starting point. You'll see those here reflected in the bright blue text. And so I'm going to pause here for just a couple minutes and give folks an opportunity to read through the goal and objectives. And then I invite you to go to slido.com. The information is on the bottom right of the screen. And please put in your reaction to the revisions on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being still feeling hesitant about these, and 5 being excited. Eli, I see your hand up. Is that a holdover from before, or did you have a question?
Hey, yeah, that's my bad for not taking it down before.
All good. And if for some reason you're having issues with Slido or just prefer to not use yet another platform, you're also welcome to put your reaction in the chat. Or if you have anything you'd like to offer in terms of feedback live, please feel free to raise your hand. Great, seeing responses in the Slido poll beginning to slow down. Still getting a few more, so we'll give folks another minute. All right, we've leveled off at about 2022 responses. Matt, could you do me a favor and share your screen with our poll results? I think you and Sarah might need to negotiate a screen swap. Oh, perfect. Let's see. All right. Matt, I feel like I'm seeing different results than what I'm seeing here on the screen. But maybe I am mistaken. Let's see. Okay, so anyways, based on the results I'm seeing here on our shared screen, as well as some that I'm seeing on our back end, I'm seeing a majority of folks who are feeling on the 4 and 5 end of the scale of hesitant to excited. On my version, I'm sorry, I don't know what the difference is between what's on our shared screen versus what I'm seeing on the back end. I've got a few people who are maybe in the middle. And so I'd just like to invite anyone who responded to the Slido poll saying they were more in the middle of this spectrum, maybe on the 3-4 range. If you have any specific items on our list of goal and objectives that you're feeling less sure about, and if you have any specific changes you'd like to offer. Matt, you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen. We'll go back to our goal and objectives. Yeah, Kathleen.
Yeah, great. Can you hear me? This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Yes, thank you.
So my reaction, so I did submit a 3, and the reason for that was, while it's possible, one of the things I'd like to see included is incorporated in one of these. It wasn't clear to me. So the thing that struck me when I read through it is there's another element of a very practical element of a stakeholder process where it needs to be manageable for a stakeholder to engage in it so that they can meet, like, actually leverage and benefit from all of these objectives you've listed. And I think of, just to kind of give an example of what I mean is, if you are required to provide input every week, but it takes 2 weeks to vet that input through your organization, then by the speed and the frequency and just how administratively burdensome that kind of process would be, it does create a framework where even if it on face tries to be open and accessible, it's actually not open and accessible to a lot of entities, especially that have to go through rigorous review processes. And since we are a heavily regulated industry, I think most of us have to go through pretty rigorous vetting. And and so that would just be one thing I'd like to see also represented somewhere in here, is just this idea of being able to feasibly engage in the process so that it can be collaborative, it can be open. Does that help?
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing is not necessarily disagreement with anything on here, but that open and accessible, there's some like real practical considerations in how we make that actually happen.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Anyone else who responded a 3 or a 4 to the poll who'd like to share any specific feedback?
Hey, can I jump in real fast? I want to respond to Kathleen's comment, and because I think it's a really important one, and has, even though it's not reflected here, this has been an aspect that we have had some really important conversations about as we've been talking in our work group about how do we, what changes are we making and how we're evaluating the various levels of staff driven versus stakeholder driven, and the amount of resources that it takes. And even as we have our conversation today about sectors, the practicality of what we're going to end up being, what we're going to end up proposing, and being able to actually implement, and if you are part of a sector, having that sector be able to show up and engage in a meaningful way, and not just represent one entity. And so having that, having the engagement be able to be meaningful and achievable is absolutely something that we think is important. So I just want to agree with the comments, and just acknowledge this is something that we've been talking about too. So I appreciate the bringing it up here, because I think it's something we want to make sure we incorporate. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Kathleen, for that response. All right, so seeing some other agreement in the Zoom chat. Yeah, Sybil.
Can you hear me? I'm new to Zoom. Oh, thank you. This is Sybil from PGP, and I think this is really a great start here. A couple of items that we've been brainstorming when thinking about sort of our recommendations that I may arise throughout this and could be interpreted as represented in here. It's a little unclear, but really like the word collaborative, but also something that we're really focused on is the concept of compromise, encouraging compromise, and recognizing that trade-offs are sometimes needed to get to compromise is a little bit different than collaboration. So recognizing that piece, I think, would be beneficial in here. And then another piece that again could be in here somewhere, that we've been thinking about is the importance of documenting minority views, even to the extent that they are not in the ultimate policy outcome. just in terms of, sort of a way to make sure that stakeholders feel heard and represented, and topics are not lost in the process. So again, I think that could be here or not. This is I think the next level up from that, but just a couple of items that we've thought about when brainstorming here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sybil. And Vijay, I'll give you the last comment. If you have additional comments other than what's being provided live, please put them in the chat. But I do want to make sure we're able to get through our agenda today. Vijay.
Thank you. Vijay Satyal, WRA, Public Interest Sector Seat Representation on the RIF. And Neha, you can tell me if I should bring this up later, because so I did a 4, and I think I'm building a bit on what Sybil said, but it's compromise requires agreement to move something up or down. So I have a proposal or an idea on what should be areas of voting and what need not be areas to vote on decision making. I'll just stop there, and whenever that comes up later, I can bring it up more. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. Yeah, that's a great segue. That is certainly one of our topics for discussion today. So invite you to keep noodling on those thoughts and be prepared to share them later on. All right, so a couple other comments in the chat. I'll read a couple of them out loud in case we have some folks on the phone who aren't able to see the chat. From Kathleen, agreement with Sybil. A process that incents compromising is so important to a healthy process. And then from Karan, want to emphasize concerns on resource availability for a given organization. In the Markets Plus process, we found some stakeholders had more resources dedicated to engaging with the stakeholder process, allowing them to exert more influence over the process, crowding out smaller orgs. This can depress accessibility and engagement in the process. An effective process should be able to look at the holistic gamut of input and evaluate it accordingly. Thanks, Karan. All right, thanks y'all for the feedback. If you have other thoughts, feel free to pop them in the chat as we go on. And there's also an opportunity for folks to provide comment on this after the workshop is over. Next slide, please. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Pam to go into our panel on our workshop 3 topic. Sarah, if I can get the next slide. So these are the 3 questions that we'll have our panel offer their thoughts and perspectives on. And then these are the same questions that y'all will have you all will have an opportunity to provide your thoughts and perspectives on in the latter half of our workshop. So Pam, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So last week, our workshop focused on the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders in initiating, selecting, and driving forward policy proposals. This we will focus on how those proposals move forward once they are selected. And so I think among the ISOs and RTOs, and we heard a lot about this last week, the CAISO process is uniquely open. There are no sector definitions outside of the Regional Issues Forum and the nominating committee. There is no voting today. There are no registered entities or membership registration fees. And so every organization or individual that is interested in a particular initiative is invited to participate in the shaping of that initiative through direct participation in stakeholder calls and the submittal of comments. In contrast, the Eastern RTOs and Markets Plus have formal sectors, formal membership, and a voting structure. Today's discussion will examine the pros and cons of these different approaches, focusing on the 3 questions that you see on your screen. We have another panel of Pathways Stakeholder Working Group members to share some of the diverse perspectives that we have in our Stakeholder Working Group on these questions. And I will now ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started on our dialogue. Scott.
Thank you, Pam. Scott Ranzel, for those don't know me, I work for Pacific Gas and Electric Company, one of the largest investor-owned utilities in California. serving Northern and Central California. I am part of our energy procurement and policy organization. I also represent on the Pathways Committee. I am part of the PTO sector inside the Pathways group. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Tony.
Hear me, Pam?
Yes.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Tony Braun, I'm a principal in Braun, Blazing and Wynn, a law firm that does primarily public power work in California and the region. I had the pleasure of serving on the Transitional Committee and then also the Governance Review Committee. I was the first chair of the Regional Issues Forum. And I also like Kirsten, one of those people that cuts across a couple different sectors. My client, the Balancing Authority of Northern California, is an EIM entity and plans to be an EDM entity, but also obviously a public power entity. So I hope to bring some of those perspectives to some of the questions today.
Josh.
Thanks, Pam. Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Walter. I manage the long-term purchase power and transmission portfolio at Seattle City Light, as well as our regional affairs or regional policy team. Similar to Tony's position, as mentioned earlier, I'm also bridging kind of two different sectors for two linked but different purposes. Currently serving as a liaison on the Regional Issues Forum for the EIM sector. I'm also a launch committee member serving the public power sector. Also similar to Tony, I've been a past chair of the Regional Issues Forum and happy to be here, Pam, and thanks for the invite.
Thank you. Allie.
Yeah, hi, I'm Allie Mace with Bonneville Power Administration. I'm in our power organization, manage our market analysis and policy organization. I'm going to continue this Regional Issues Forum theme here. I am currently the RIF sector liaison for the Power Marketing Administrations and the current co-chair of the RIF with Meg McNall as chair. I am not on the launch committee, but am on the stakeholder process work group. And one bit of background on Bonneville that's relevant to this topic. Bonneville's been really active. We're active in both the CAISO processes, and we've been active in Markets Plus with the development of the tariff. And also appreciate the invitation to join this panel today and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And Ian.
Hey everyone, Ian White, Director of Regulatory Affairs at Shell Energy. Yeah, and I once was a RIF sector liaison for the IPP and marketer sector. Handed that off to much more qualified folks earlier this year. And I am on the stakeholder working group in the Pathways process that's examining the stakeholder process. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have a theme of Regional Issues Forum sector liaisons with also former sector liaison and RIF chair. But I think that reflects that we've thought a lot about sectors and the role of sectors and how stakeholders can get involved. So let's turn to our first question. Sector definitions. Should sectors be established and weighted for voting purposes? In the sector and working group process in CAISO today, we noted there are no formal sectors. But in the Regional Issues Forum, the sectors are identified as EIM entities, ISO participating transmission owners, consumer-owned utilities located within an EIM balancing authority area that are not included in another sector, public interest groups, and consumer advocate groups that are actively involved in energy issues within the EIM footprint, and then independent power producers and marketers who engage in transactions within the EIM footprint. The RIF also includes a liaison from the Federal Power Marketing Administrations. Markets Plus defined sectors as investor-owned utilities, public power, and independents. So turning first to Tony and Ian, what role do sector definitions play in your perspective? Tony, do you want to maybe kick us off?
It is from my perspective and history on this, I think it's sort of multifaceted issue. I think sectors are essential. I think they provide indicia of inclusiveness. I think they help get the right people at the table. I think the whole process of identifying the sectors and then pulling candidates out of those sectors is helpful to consensus building. So all those things I think are pros in there. I think I probably get less worked up about the definitions of the sectors than many do. I get nervous when sectors get too granular. I think one of the lessons that we've learned is that making the sectors broad forces people to work together to come up with plans for populating the sectors and the relative positions in the stakeholder processes, like the RIF and other places. Things have changed. There's a lot more players at the table now, and so probably some flexibility and change and evolution is a good idea. But at the same time, I still think it's healthy to have that tension where we try to force, for lack of a better term, some consensus building to populate the sectors. So sector's good. We can get into some of the nitty gritty of the definitions and things like that as we continue to talk, but I think they're essential. But I think also we should be cautious about trying to be so granular in how we define and divide them.
Tony, those are really good points, and I'm glad you mentioned them. I think it's our experience in the IPP and marketer sector is largely the same. I think one of the benefits of having some similarly situated folks within the same group is that it's helpful to sort of zoom in on areas where there are consensus out of the gate and areas where maybe we're using different terminology to describe the same thing, or where the areas also where there isn't consensus. I think one of the difficult things about at least how things are structured in RIF is that our sector, that sector I formerly represented, the IPP and marketers, independent load serving entities. It's quite an unruly sector. There's 70, as I remember, 70 or so entities that are part, and so trying to touch base with all of them is difficult, and functionally it's like different entities with very different business models all within the same sector, whereas I would sort of argue that the other RIF sectors, generally the business model of IOUs is all roughly the same. The business model or the situation of PMAs is likely roughly the same. So I think that the way that the RIF slices and dices the sectors is pretty it works well. I think one area is that the IPP and marketer sector, it leaves some things to be desired, but that's just a function of how diverse our sector is.
Thank you both. So turning to Scott and Allie, do defined sectors promote or disincentivize the collaboration and coalition building across sectors?
Allie, you want to start?
Sure, I can go ahead. Yeah, I think kind of to some of what Tony was saying in his response, which I agree with what he was saying. I feel like they promote it in our experience. I would just share, I think I'll share a little bit from both experiences. In the Markets Plus experience, we were pretty pleasantly surprised by the enthusiasm and engagement to dig in on issues and shape compromises and consensus approaches across the sectors. Some of that gets to voting, which I know we'll talk about later on, but the sector definitions didn't seem like they were a barrier to that collaboration. I think in defined sectors can help to provide some good, helpful parameters for organizing issues and input. when I look at entities like the RIF, I think you have diversity across the sectors, but then you have a body consisting of the sector representatives, of course, who bring the perspective of their sector, but also bring the sort of mission and charge to collaborate with their colleagues from other sectors, not necessarily to always agree, but to collaborate, discuss, compromise, talk about where there are differences. So I see the defined sectors promoting collaboration. I think they give some helpful boundaries within which that collaboration and compromise can occur. So I'll hand it to you, Scott, for your thoughts.
I would reiterate a lot of what Ali and others have already said. I think the sectors have the opportunity to promote that. I think if they go too far, they can create a disincentive. And one thing I want to point out here that's a theme that'll run across a lot of my comments today. We are creating a culture. The sector is an excellent representation of that culture. That culture can have a very positive bent to it. It can have a very negative bent to it. And whatever sectors we set up, if you have ineffective sector leads, the sector is going to struggle. The role of the sector lead cannot be underestimated in this process. It's a critical element to allow voices to rise, collaboration and communication and compromise to be facilitated through that sector lead. And in that light, it can be an extremely positive and productive measure. Let me stop there, but I think that the sectors have the possibility to allow voices to come forth and to achieve a lot of the objectives that we had aligned out on the slides earlier today.
So maybe, Ian, I might ask you to respond a little bit to Scott's point there around, maybe ask a more pointed question here. You mentioned that the IPP sector has by far the most members, but there have been points where, finding that leadership or someone who's willing to step into that leadership role has been a challenge. Can you maybe talk about, respond to Scott's point there, and from your perspective of a large sector with members pulled in many different directions about finding that good leadership?
Yeah, no, Scott, you make a good point that within the framework of the RIF, yeah, the sector leads are quite important. I think one thing that, at least in my view, was sort of challenging is sort of wrangling that many entities with that many entities sort of viewpoints on issues. An issue that strikes like a developer of batteries may strike differently for a marketer. And so figuring out which issues matter to whom, I think, and slicing and dicing that can be a little bit of a mind puzzle. I think that also another thing is our sector, to broadly paint with a broad brush here, our sector also runs pretty lean in terms of resourcing at individual companies. And so, if I phoned over to a colleague at a demand response provider, they're covering a lot of ground. And so some of those items may not sort of percolate up to the top of their inbox, and maybe without a call or reaching out to them more directly. And so I think that the touches required look different potentially depending upon what sector you're in and what and then what level of engagement or resourcing each of those entities that make up your sector possess.
Thank you. So maybe I'll go to Ian and Tony for a final follow-up question. So there's a lot of different ways to slice a sector. So for example, Ian, you just mentioned on IPPs, there's generation owners, power marketers, demand response providers, energy storage operators. I think we could keep going. And similarly with public power, we have federal power marketing agencies, cooperatives, municipals, public utility districts, and then public power districts that have a balancing authority and public power districts that take service from a balancing authority. Can maybe you both discuss some of the trade-offs between these large sectors with diverse membership compared to a more tailored sector definition with a more uniform membership? And I'll maybe start with Josh here. You're on mute there.
All right, Pam. You lost me for half a second. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry. I was lost.
That's okay. So I think you both represent sectors that can be defined very broadly. So all public power or carved up into more detailed uniform components like municipalities versus public utility districts. Can you maybe talk about the trade-offs between the broader sector definition with a diverse membership compared to those narrowly tailored sectors that have a uniform membership?
Sure. Yeah, I do think the broader representation ultimately I think is can create there obviously will be and can be a higher level of input, right? And that input could very much be diverse, and it oftentimes is. But I do think that rolling up into a more diverse sector or a more diverse level of representation is helpful in recognizing that there is most likely going to see and be a number of different viewpoints, and those viewpoints ultimately can be there's difficulties in the representation of that, but at the same time that those difficulties can help in the creation of compromise, kind of as Sybil was talking about earlier. We've, as a PGP member, have very much thought about how we can work towards and promote compromise in these processes. So rolling it up into a broader set of, the bigger picture representation, I think is helpful. And it is more, I think, promotes the idea of collaboration in the end. I think that that's actually one of the more helpful elements associated with the way that at least functionally, how the RIF is working today, having kind of a somewhat smaller group of individuals and entities allows for a pretty strong level of collaboration and focus. So I think that continue, at least my personal belief is that a broader representation is helpful in achieving some of the goals that we're attempting to achieve.
Ian, your thoughts?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Actually, I tend to agree with Josh. I think that the broader the sector, I think, is more ideal. I think that there are certainly trade-offs to more tailored and more narrow sector definitions, and certainly benefits to defining them more broadly as well. I think that given the goals at the top of this call that we were examining and looking at objectives, I think that keeping things more broadly defined is quite good in the interest of promoting one, inclusion, but two, sort of trying to drive to that compromise. I think that for our sector, we just have to, all of us collectively have to be clear-eyed about what that means and the level of engagement that requires, either for the RIF sector leads or others that are, maybe some of the leading voices in that sector may have to allocate more time to those ends and represent a broader group of folks in a more effective way. And I'm not saying that is hard or that can't be done or can be done. I think it certainly can. I think we just have to stay clear-eyed about that. that is
Thanks, Ian.
also in our sector, I think it is sometimes a bit of a heavy lift, when you may need to devote significant time to, the collective good, when you're just one company sort of footing that time and footing that bill.
Thank you. So turning to our next question on voting, does stakeholder engagement include voting? If so, how frequently should sector-based voting be scheduled? And I'll start with Scott and Tony. You have both participated in the CAISO stakeholder process for many years. Can you share some of the positive characteristics of the open approach to the stakeholder process? And from your perspective, what are some of the drawbacks?
I'd be happy to lead that off, Scott, if that's all right. So I am a proponent of voting. Voting for what purpose, I think is a future question. But the obviously the CAISO process right now does not have voting. So it does allow a very wide variety of perspectives and entities to participate. And it also, I think, is a good protection for those that can perhaps find themselves in a minority position or have a particular interest that might not get, be fully reflected in some sort of formalized voting structure. And I like to be specific, and I raised this on a recent call. In the initial stages of formation of the resource adequacy program in California, there was a creation of a flexible capacity obligation. And, a bunch of people got together and said, okay, we're going to have this obligation, and everyone looks the same, and we're just going to peanut butter the costs on a load ratio share basis. Well, we did not look the same. We did not have the same resource portfolios, the same load shapes, et cetera. And we pushed back, and ultimately were able to demonstrate through a lot of facts and figures that there needed to be something that better tracked cost causation. And I get nervous in a structured process that kind of ability to raise those issues would get lost. Whereas in the CAISO process, we were able to raise it and raise it with not only the stakeholders, but also ISO management, and say, look, this is just not fair and not reasonable. And I would get nervous that those kinds of opportunities to make particular cases would be lost. So I do think voting has some advantages. I do think the accountability element of it is very important, and I'm really anxious to introduce that into CAISO stakeholder processes. But I think we should be measured in how we do that. And I think, the prior example that I gave, sort of a specific example on how the open process can allow, issues to get solved in a manner that perhaps a more structured process would not.
Thanks, Tony. Scott, can you share your thoughts, please?
I would like to understand how Tony saw my notepad and wrote down voting for what purpose. But it's a magic trick that Tony's pulling. But I would agree a lot with a lot of what Tony communicated. I think voting is a reflection of desire. That actually already happens inside the CAISO. It's not labeled as a vote, but it is very clear in the CAISO processes where people want to be. So I think if voting is a reflection of desire, and that can help with accountability and visualizing what is happening, adding that to the CAISO process seems like it would be have a positive bend to it. For example, in one of the recent votes, they had an indicative vote, and I think it was helpful to have the board see clearly across the board where people were. Voting can also have its challenges. If you get to weighted voting and sector voting, there's a vote. As we've already talked about, inside the sectors, there can be a lot of consistency, and there's also a lot of variation and nuance to what people are voting on, and a clear-cut vote answer that says this is what shall happen, I worry at times will reduce some of the collaboration, reduce some of the clear and consistent information. One of the things that I appreciate about and enjoy in the CAISO process is the commenting process, the ability to speak to the board where people can reflect that nuance and that importance to them that would not necessarily come across in a vote. And I think it's a valuable piece of that process. So how do you introduce voting? I think the idea is a good one. But again, how you introduce that voting and not reduce clarity, consistency, the ability to compromise must be mitigated in the way in which you introduce voting.
Thank you. And we're having great dialogue. We're super close to our allotted agenda time. So I think we've got to move through our remaining questions pretty quickly. But I'll turn to Josh and Ian and really when you're looking at a stakeholder process, what gives you confidence that your organization's perspective is being taken into consideration? How do you feel that the organization is being responsive to your comments or your direct feedback? I'll start with Josh.
Pam, a couple different thoughts here. I think relationships and commitment matter. I think if I weren't sector liaison for the RIF, I feel like access to and communicating with our sector liaisons under the current construct works. But again, in order for that to work, you need to continue to maintain a relationship and a commitment to communicate. In terms of organizational viewpoint, the multiple touch points and opportunities for engagement with the market operator and their processes, as well as the opportunity to communicate positions within the sector has been pretty positive. And maybe to give an example of a positive outcome, right, is the most recent and very nascent currently operation of the bid cap issue that came out of a RIF meeting that then turned very quickly into a stakeholder process that as of yesterday came into operations, right? So the storage community and the hydro community ultimately kind of showcased this issue and this problem that came out of the way that the market was operating, largely from the MLK Day weekend cold snap. The market or the market participants and affected entities ultimately saw this as a problem, and we got a very responsive outcome from CAISO. So, I think that that's a real element and showcase of how, at least currently, processes work and can work in favor of market participants. That doesn't also mean that the process isn't flawed. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for improvements as it relates to this voting construct. I do think that there's a lot of value in voting. But as both Tony and Scott mentioned, that the role of voting is to be determined, and I think needs to be put in place where appropriate in order to promote accountability, yet also allow some level of fluidity of process.
Thank you.
Josh, you said it well. I think that, yeah, absolutely. I think the way I would slice this question is there's sort of the before EDAM Markets Plus conversation of stakeholder work at CAISO, and sort of maybe the post. I think that a lot of stakeholders, having been given a bit of a taste of a different stakeholder approach, has promoted a conversation about how do we change a stakeholder process in the future for the better. And I think, Josh, you hit the nail on the head in that in the current frame, you have to communicate proactively and often in order to remain engaged and to allow the market operator to stay abreast of your sector or your individual entity's perspectives. I really like and appreciate about the status quo how open and open for input the process is. That being said, the flip side is I think the voting maybe more narrowly defined or voting more narrowly used to indicate directional support for individual pieces of the policy conversation as something moves through the stakeholder process, I think is quite an improvement upon the status quo. For one, in terms of being able to build a record for accountability, but I would also argue that sort of indicative voting or directional indicative voting, however you want to say it, is quite inclusive in that some entities, some organizations may not have the resources to comment on everything with footnotes and document and build a record, but you sure likely can sort of log on to the KISO system or log on to a system and record your vote. And then when it comes time to present that information at the board, it's, I think, tells a bit more of a complete story rather than, you know, assuming and relying on board members in their own time to go back through and read endless reams of comments.
So Allie, you've had a lot of experience with the Markets Plus voting process. Can you share some of that experience, especially since last week we heard about a learning curve with voting? How do you think that voting impacts the stakeholder process and could be effectively incorporated?
Yeah, thanks, Pam. Yeah, we have had a lot of experience with Markets Plus voting, so I'll try to keep comments brief with time. But I think overall, we felt like the voting in the Markets Plus process was a positive experience. There was definitely a learning curve. Remember those first meetings when everyone was kind of trying to figure out, like, wait, how does this work? What am I doing? But that I would expect with any new process for sure. But after that brief initial learning curve, we were pretty impressed with how voting helped to move things along. Calling for that vote, that advisory vote, could be a very powerful tool at times in meetings to kind of getting out of a spinning topic and identifying where people stood, so then you could move forward on the compromise and collaboration, not necessarily end with the vote, but that gave you a sense of where they were. We also found, this has been mentioned a couple of times, but that the advisory voting really fostered collaboration and compromise, especially on some tough issues like GHG accounting, because folks knew that there was ultimately a vote and that an issue wouldn't move forward unless it had support. It drove a high level of accountability and, in our experience, desire to an interest in compromising so that we would come up with some solution rather than everyone kind of getting in their corners and standing their ground. So we felt like it was beneficial in driving compromise and kind of forcing entities to work together who might normally just have different perspectives. It definitely we felt it gave stakeholders increased ownership and some accountability for the outcomes, and put some emphasis on stakeholders either understanding an issue or just saying, you know, understand, also accept, or maybe in some cases accepting that this was a complex issue, they may not understand it, and then, you know, they would have an abstention in the vote, and that gives you good information. That's good data to know as well. And I think one of the things that we mentioned that we feel like is really important in the voting is that ability to have minority opinions represented and to have that transparency in the voting, so you can see after a vote, it gives you a really good sense of where everyone stands. Because of the way they ran the voting, you could see where everyone was. And in a few cases, that led to some follow-on conversations where there wasn't agreement in voting to identify those particular stakeholders who weren't supportive of it, to try to work on how you could, you know, how could you change the proposal and what ultimately went to the board to address their concerns. So I think those are some of the key elements. I mean, overall, we've talked about advisory voting, indicative voting. I think having that and binding voting in some cases, but having that voting be advisory to the independent board still gives the board the ability to make the final decision. They're holding that decision, but they've got a lot of data from participating entities when they make that decision, and a lot of transparency into where folks stand on an issue. So that, I think that's kind of the high points of our experience so far in Markets Plus, and what we feel like has been working well in that voting structure. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Allie. I really appreciate the addition of that perspective. We are actually over time, but I want to just give any of our panelists an opportunity to share any closing thoughts We've talked about voting. We've talked about the role of comments. We've completely gotten off, well, not to our third question on standing committees. But if anyone wants to help kind of close us out with any final thoughts, I would welcome them from our panelists. Well, then, thank you all. I think we're keeping you from a break, and I will turn it back over to our GridWorks team to set us up for that.
Thanks, Pam. Briefly before we go to break, I did want to open it up to our group if they have any clarifying questions for our panelists on the comments that they shared. And we're going to keep this to clarifying questions. If you have commentary about what our panelists shared, that's what we'll do in the latter half of the workshop. I'm going to first go to Ryan, who raised his hand earlier, and then I'll work through to Kathleen and Vijay. Go ahead, Ryan.
Actually, you can go to somebody else. It was more of a clarifying comment, not really a clarifying question.
Okay, great. We'll hold on to that comment for after break. Kathleen.
Great, thanks. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. This is a question for Ian White from Shell.
Yeah, go ahead, Kathleen.
Great. So Ian, you talked a little bit about just the size of the IPP and marketer sector that the RIF has set up. I know you're in other, you mentioned the other entities that you're engaged in that have different structures. I was hoping you could help put a finer point on that, if you could explain the challenges around having a sector that includes so many perspectives, like in the IPP and marketers, it's supply and load serving entities, financial marketers, load curtailment marketers. Like, I think that piece was just a little lost for me. And I'd like to see if you could provide a little bit more detail around on that. And if you have any ideas for how you think it could be better structured.
Ian, have we lost you? Okay, it seems like we may have lost Ian.
That's okay.
We might have gone to break a little bit early. So let's just take that as an opportunity.
That would be great.
All of us to go to break, and we can revisit your question when we come back, Kathleen. So I have that I'm at 10:08 on Pacific time, so 11:08 and 12:08 where the rest of y'all are. We'll come back at 10:18, 11:18, 12:18. Thanks all. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a chance to stretch your legs, get some water, whatever you needed. We will start where we left off. I think there were a couple of questions from folks for our panelists. And let's see. Let's do our last question was to Ian. Ian, I don't know if you are back on. Okay. Not a problem. Kathleen, we'll just bring your question up in the context of our discussion as we move forward. So this is our opportunity. We have about an hour and 15 minutes to go through discussion together today. And a slight difference from our conversation last week where we sort of just like opened it up to the floor for comments on any part of stakeholder process input. Today, I am going to take us in a little bit of a stepwise manner, similar to how Pam went through the panel. So we're going to start out with our question on sectors, then move to our question on voting, and then finally to our question on standing committees. And so our question on sectors, should sectors be established? And if so, how should they be defined? Welcome your individual thoughts on this, as well as welcome reflections that you have on what was shared in the panel that Pam just facilitated. Would love to hear what perspectives stood out to you. If there were any points of view that you didn't hear represented by the launch committee, perspectives that you felt comfortable with, ones that you were feeling challenged by. And then I think we heard some ideas from our launch committee members. If you have specific ideas or hybrid ideas that you think the launch committee should consider, we also welcome those. So it looks like I have quite the line of commenters. I am going to go in order. Vijay, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Can you hear me, please?
Oh, and sorry, Vijay, one moment. Y'all have been doing a great job of this, but just a reminder, when you speak, please introduce yourself, your name, as well as what organization you are representing. Thanks. Vijay, go ahead.
Thank you. Vijay Satyal, WRA. I'm also the public interest liaison on the RIF, and appreciate all the thoughts from Tony and others. I do have an observation to share, is that the public interest sector is quite varied and diverse, like I heard one of the other sectors was. And we've been, I like to call in a joint marriage with the consumer sector. And sometimes that's been hard to get input. So in this new format or structure being conceived or envisioned or proposed, I recommend that public interest and consumer advocates have their own sectors. It just makes it cleaner, simpler, and there should be a tribal sector as well. We can't ignore the tribes, and this is our chance to have a specific sector representation for them. The other item I really support was the majority minority perspective of the sectors that can be reflected to the board. I again have a very specific thought on voting, but I'll keep it for later. Thank you.
Yeah, you're on
I'm
mute.
muted. Thank you. Thanks, Vijay, for your comments, and thanks all for maintaining your comments about voting. We'll just keep those to the side for the moment, but please remember to note them. Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Ryan Millard from NextEra Energy Resources. I'm the Senior Director of Regulatory and Political Affairs. Great discussion. I wanted to make two comments, but I'll stick with the first regarding sector. I think that the first is that regardless of sector size, I think you're always going to have splinter factions form over issues that are of unique concern to an organization's individual goals. And that's particularly true in diverse sectors, of which NextEra is one. The less formal structure of CAISO's stakeholder framework sort of allows for that, and that you have the ability to collaborate and or advocate as a subgroup of your sector, or even cross-collaborate with other sectors. But I also share and appreciate some of the comments raised about introducing voting that I think it is important. I'll save my comment for later on voting, but that's what I wanted to say about the sectors.
Thanks, Ryan. And sorry to disrupt the flow, but definitely welcome folks to raise their hand and share their comments out loud. If you'd like to share comments in the chat, please do that as well. And if you have lengthy comments or if you'd like your comments to remain anonymous, we do have a Slido poll open where you can provide written responses to the questions as well. Fred, go ahead.
Hi there. Yeah, it's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. I'm also on the WEC Member Advisory Committee, and I'm bringing this up because WEC has member classes. They're basically sectors, and our experience is the sectors are a way, in effect, of populating different kinds of committees, including the Member Advisory Committee, where we have 5 direct sectors represented. And this is one of the issues, which is in WEC's case, they're international, quote unquote, members, which are really from British Columbia and Alberta, which are part of the Western Interconnection, get kind of a special recognition because, of course, they're not in the U.S. This raises issues of jurisdiction and so forth. And just, trying to maintain a balanced approach to sectoral representation, in WEC, we give the international, quote unquote, the international members some special recognition, basically, so that their interests are treated properly. And these are the kinds of complications that come up when you start doing sectoral approaches. The question I want to ask is, and just for consideration, is we talk about sectors, but I think it's very important to understand, what do we intend that to do? Is it intended, as it is in the Eastern multi-state RTOs, to be basically a formalized and pretty rigid approach to organizing different groupings within the overall organization in a way that is fully binding throughout the entire process? Or is it a way that I think that kind of the other end of that spectrum, like we see in effect with the CAISO RIF and with the nominating process, where sectors are a little bit more flexible in their interpretation, in their memberships, in their participation processes. And this connects then to the voting issue, which I know we're going to get to. But I just think it's important to consider and just reflecting also on Tony's comment about the range, kind of the amount of sectors you have. I mean, there are a lot of dynamics here that are worth thinking about in considering not just whether to have sectors or not, but what are they for? And that's the point that I wanted to raise.
Thanks, Fred. Brian.
Hi there. Thanks. Sorry, took me a minute to get off mute. This is Brian Turner, Advanced Energy United. A couple of comments regarding sectors, and I've spoken up before to advocate for a flexibility in approach, and I want to reiterate that here, at least informality to sector definition or an ability to have some flexibility and evolution. For one reason is that our organization represents a range of market participants or technology providers to the market, from large-scale renewable to distributed energy resources. Secondly, is that those resource types and market participants and other stakeholders will evolve over time, as we see distributed energy resources under Order 2222 coming about as a critical participant. And our organization is active in all the other markets in the country outside of CAISO, and being lumped in with IPPs when you've got a diversity of resources and market participants and stakeholders really is dilutive to the voice. And last point perhaps that I want to make is also, in many ways we share a perspective with public interest organizations, and that the one overriding commonality between the participants, between our members, is the dedication to 100% clean energy system. And that is something that can take different forms, can have us advocating for different positions amongst that varied resource portfolio that we represent. So really, I just want to say that, first of all, We don't support, rigid sector definitions, certainly not broad, rigid, lasting stakeholder definitions. And when stakeholder definitions are necessary to get that kind of indicative view related to voting, then they should have some fluidity, and perhaps by self-election per opportunity when stakeholder voting matters, or stakeholder representation, sector representation matters, if that makes sense. So you elect each time that opportunity comes up. I think that's all the points I wanted to make. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Brian, for your comments. Alicia.
Thanks, Alicia Vinoy, Regulatory Affairs Manager for Renew Home. First of all, I just want to thank the RIF IPP sector leads for being so welcoming to the demand response community when we were trying to identify, how to join the RIF and in which sector do we belong. So I don't want these comments to reflect in any way the great welcoming nature of the IPP sector leads. So I will note that the IPP sector has, I think, almost 88 different companies that are in that sector right now. And the demand response participants make up a very, very small group. I think there's maybe 4 of us in there. And as new participants in the sector, we haven't really come up against the issues that we're likely to see, in which demand response operational considerations and market rules are drastically different than the interests of traditional generators or even renewable generators. So I just think that taking into consideration, like maybe if there's like a subsector within the sector or something where like the small voices don't get drowned out by just a sheer numbers game. So taking that into consideration, and I think that will also inform, some of the concerns that might come up around voting within sectors. And so I just think that we should consider that as well when moving forward.
Thanks, Alicia. Karinia, I saw you'd put a comment in the chat that you have a comment. Would you like to share that out loud, or would you like to share that in the chat?
No, sorry, I was just sort of lining up in the queue there to be able to share. No, I would like to share it out loud. I think my comment is actually similar. I heard, I was thinking about it but I think it's similar to Fred's, which is that it's not quite clear to me yet the level of authority that the stakeholder group will have with regards to, the board of this new RO. Is it ultimately sort of an ISO, ISO New England, PJM, Eastern like structure, and the fact that the stakeholders have a fairly significant authority compared to the board? Or is it advisory? And to me, that's kind of the core question that has to be figured out first, because if it is if it's not advisory, if the stakeholder working group, the stakeholders have a significant authority position with respect to the board, then you've really got to nail down the sectors, because it's all about sector voting and ensuring the fact that those votes are represent, because each business ultimately at the end of the day, compromise is good, but ultimately companies will vote based on the positions of what's good for the business. That's what they're there to do, right? But if it's advisory, this whole sort of you don't really need sector level voting, sector weighted voting. It's much more, it seems like it can be much more fluid. Do you feel that we've got an answer to that core question of what ultimately at the end of the day is the authority of the stakeholder working group with regards to the board? Or is that still being determined? Because to me, you figure out like, what is your objective? And then the rest of it goes like the structure, or whether you have voting or don't have voting, whether you have sectors or don't have sectors is all supporting the objective at the end of the day. And the objective at the end of the day is how much authority does the stakeholder working group have compared to the board.
Thanks, Karinia. To your last point, I might invite Kathleen or Pam to offer a response because I think it interacts with some of the work happening in other work streams.
Yeah, so I think that you're hitting on our framing question, and that we are trying to get a lot of different perspectives on the balance that you shared between stakeholders and the board. And I think that there are some of those framing questions that have to be answered first, but that we also want to understand how these different components would flow up into those framing sectors. So I think that we do have a number of different pathways to get to a final result, but that we're really trying to get a diverse group of perspectives on those questions and then some of the nuance underneath those questions so that we can come to an initial recommendation to really test what we've heard with the stakeholder community. So again, I think the comments that we will solicit after this workshop, as well as the comments on some of the other working group workshops that we have already had and that we will have in the next few weeks will help us frame out those fundamental questions and then add some of the detail that we're hearing here about the pros and cons to those framing questions to really come back with an initial package that will really just be an opportunity to get, again, stakeholder feedback on if we've landed in the right place so that we can continue to dial in on the right balance between stakeholders and the board while, really centering on the public interest that has been, I think, the core of our mission and our inauguration since our regulators gave us this task and this charter. So a really good question. I think it's one of the balances that we continue to wrestle with in our working group as well as across the launch committee. So appreciate that frame, and hopefully we will be able to kind of work through some of the details to get to that recommendation.
Thanks, Pam, for that response. See some additional comments in the chat, also reflecting that sort of interplay with the role between the role of the board, the role of the stakeholders. Natalie.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Natalie McIntyre. I'm a senior advocate for NRDC in the MISO and SPP stakeholder processes. And I just thought I would share some experience from my participation in other regions of the country over many years. I'm hoping that this group is looking not just at CalISO and at Markets Plus as sort of your examples for what a stakeholder process might look like. And on this particular question of sectors, I think that there is a big benefit to having more granularity in sectors, regardless of whether or not votes are binding or advisory. In MISO in particular, there are a number of sectors, but votes there are advisory. But I think it's still very helpful to have the sectors broken out so that it's really clear both to MISO staff, to other stakeholders, and to the board of directors what the diversity of views are amongst those sectors. So, how do the perspectives of large loads differ from those of generation developers or consumer advocates? So I guess I'm just suggesting consideration of a larger set of sectors so that there can really be a lot more clarity in terms of understanding what the different perspectives are, and also just offer that if there is voting, that split sector votes can even offer a little bit more granularity when a sector can't find a unified position. So thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Thanks, Natalie. Let's see, we have got 4 more people in the queue, and then I do think I'll move us to our voting discussion because it seems like we're all eager to get to that. So in my queue, I have Sybil, Scott, Ryan, and Lisa. If you are not one of those 4 people and you have comments, please feel free to share them in the chat, or also put them in the Slido poll. Let's see. Sybil, go ahead.
Hi, this is Sybil from PGP. One piece that I'm not sure has come up in the discussion so far, but that we've recognized is an important lens for looking at this question is that one of the things that is I think a bit unique about the CAISO process is that items are organized by topical area, and so we're enabled, once things are in the in a an initiative level process, it's a little bit narrow, just a little bit narrower of a discussion. And so sometimes it may enable some of the self-selection of participants in a broader sector that have specific interests in a particular issue. And so it may be a little bit of a different environment for thinking about sectors and the roles they play versus broader, maybe work, for example, in the CAISO's recent practice of the working group processes where you're having a very broad discussion that's a whole host of issues in a really deep category, and the focus is how to define and prioritize issues. Then you want, there isn't that self-selection enabled yet. It's the really broad representation is super important at that phase. So just thinking a little bit about kind of how the sector roles and the importance of sectors, as well as how voting can aid in the process, may differ depending on kind of where we're at in the process. Thanks.
Thanks for those comments, Sybil. Scott.
Thank you. I want to reflect and reinforce a little bit of what Pam said. Karina and Fred, I think your point around what is the sector organization going to do is an important question. We are wrestling with that with the idea of it has impact on the objectives. I think many people are aware of that. How can you accomplish at as robust a level as possible all of the objectives that are laid out? And as a simple example, when you get to a binding sector vote, that increases the requirement and level of participation. And we know that many have struggled to figure out how to do that effectively. VJ, was pointing out earlier the public interest sector, which is, how do you get them involved and engaged? They are involved and engaged, supported and heard throughout that process. So the push and pull on the objectives based on the decision that you make is part of the reason why we are continuing to push on the stakeholders. And it becomes, I want to reiterate a point I made in the panel. Whatever structure that is established by the launch committee, it is the culture and the stakeholders that are going to have to absorb, adapt, and modify their behavior to accommodate it, to make it successful. It is the stakeholders that will make this process successful, not the formulation of, here's the framework. I think the framework is very important. I don't want to undersell it, but it is the stakeholder involvement and engagement and participation in these activities at each level that they can be represented, heard, and involved that will make this a success. No per se framework is the golden answer. Otherwise, all the RTOs and ISOs would have adopted it. And I want to reflect, Natalie, to your point, you hear a lot about CAISO and SPP, obviously, because we have a lot of people involved and engaged in those, but we are doing a comprehensive look at all of the RTOs and ISOs stakeholder process and engaging with them. So if you have suggestions for us about who we might talk to in some of the other markets, we'd love to hear it. We have already been doing that, but we're certainly ready, willing, and able to hear other perspectives. And I think where we probably land is 2 of PJM, 1 of New England, ISO New England, 1 of SPP, 3 of CAISO, 2 of, we're going to create our own thing, as we often do in the West. And I think that suits and fits the needs of the West. And that's a good thing. That's part of the reason why we're all out here. Thank you for the chance to speak.
Thanks, Scott, for those comments. And yeah, to your sorry, to your closing remark that there's many processes, and I think what's going to be created here is going to be some amalgamation or some new version of that. We invite folks to look back at the research brief, don't know what to call it, research brief that GridWorks put out at the beginning of this effort, trying to outline the processes that happen across RTOs and ISOs across the country. And so, the conversation today is certainly not limited to what does CAISO do, what does SPP Markets Plus do, not even limited to what does PJM or ISO New England do, but like amongst all of that, like what are the options? We can take the best of everything out there. So thanks for that reminder, Scott. Let's see. I see I have quite a few hands in the queue. I do want to get us to our discussion on voting, since I'm feeling lots of eagerness there. So I'm going to keep this last live sector comment to Lisa, and Kathleen and Vijay, if you have other comments about sectors, I invite you to either put them in the chat or put them in the Slido.
Thank you very much. Lisa Torman-Hickey, representing the Interwest Energy Alliance. Really appreciate the conversation. It does help to formalize views a little better, which were scattered before this conversation today. I'm still pondering and reflecting on all of this important input, but appreciate the recognition that sectors allow a individual voice to engage while not always having to pick up the pen and doing all the research yourself. So when you are able to move into the flow of a sector, that is helpful to provide that input while saving effort on all the various processes going on. And yet, if sectors are formed, I do think they need to be granular enough to represent the potential for divisions within them. For example, the IPP RIF as currently formed, I think includes power marketers, which is not always the same voice and often is quite different, and so could be divided up at least to that extent. So I liked Natalie's discussion about advisory voting. I don't think we want to go to a strict formal voting, because that puts too much pressure on the sectors, which will never be able to fully represent all of their diverse voices, and yet, again, helps channel people, focus people, leaves aside some of the less important issues and moves towards compromise. So sectors that are granularly developed with only advisory voting, if we go to voting, it can be helpful to move towards compromise and yet reflect all of the important diverse voices. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Apologies to Vijay and Kathleen that I wasn't able to get to your comments live, but appreciate you putting them in the chat. All right, so we've been ooching into our voting discussion already, but we'll move us there formally. Sarah, could I have our next slide? Oh, one less, or one back. Yeah, thank you. So the very broad question here is, should stakeholder engagement include voting? There's obviously a number of nuanced questions below that. If you do think voting should be used, how could it be used, on what issues? So our launch committee members, again, shared some of their perspectives on this question. Invite you to share which of the launch committee perspectives stood out to you, to share perspectives that you didn't hear the launch committee offer, and of perspectives shared not only by the launch committee, but by your fellow participants here, which ones you feel comfortable with, which ones you feel challenged by. I really want to start that dialogue. So let's see, we'll open it up to raised hands. Sybil, I see your hand raised, but I think that might be a holdover from our last question. Okay, great. Ryan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, this is Ryan from NextEra Energy Resources. Just a comment. I think voting has a potential to complicate engagement and sometimes discourage engagement altogether if you know you're a minority voice on a specific issue. I think this was touched on. So I really appreciated Ian's point about maybe narrowing the application of when and how voting's leveraged, and then also Ali's point about using voting to get out of a spinning topic. I think that's an area where I've been in the stakeholder environment where we do sometimes spend and there's no way out because we don't have that finality that comes with some kind of voting structure. So I think being deliberate about how and when voting is employed can help us avoid a structure that is too rigid or too limiting. So really appreciate those comments in particular.
Thank you, Ryan. Vijay.
Yes, thank you, Vijay, WRA. We are used to, if it helps Ryan and others, the public interest sector is often used to being in the minority anyways. So not trying to claim special status of sympathy here. But I think what I'd like to share is one thing that came across very clearly from the panelists earlier on was there was a clear recognition that sectors do help. They do matter. They organize the thoughts and can bring more perspectives to the table. I do feel that if we are going to move into this new RO structure, if we're not going to be committee-based like other Eastern markets have, the staff will need guidance on some matters if you want things to move up or down. So what I've proposed in the chat is a critical decision list framework, where if this is a CDI, that's my acronym, I just created it, then it needs to get sector positions, whether you call it voting or positions. And even if it's majority minority, then the board gets clear guidance. How much is a topic of importance to whom? So that's one thing I just wanted to highlight. And second is there should be a role for state input. And the question I have there is, are we going to have another like a CASR and BOSSR? Or are we going to rebrand BOSSR into something here? So that's a question and my observation. Thank you. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Vijay. Yeah, just I think all of you probably know the acronyms even better than I do, but BOSSR is Board of State Regulators. Kathleen.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Yes, you're a little soft, but we can hear you.
Okay, if I joined by my phone, if this isn't working, I can reconnect with my computer audio. Just let me know. So would that be better? Can you hear me? Yeah.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Sorry, I came off mute for a second. Great. No, thanks for the opportunity to share some perspectives. So I'll start with that so Kathleen from Vistra, I don't think we should make perfect be the enemy of the good. Also, devils are in the detail. We use two commonly used idioms, but this one is one where it's really true. I've heard lots of pros and cons, strong feelings about voting from a lot of individuals, including those at the ISO RTOs. And so I want to acknowledge that if set up poorly, voting can be very detrimental, and it can add friction to the process, and it can result in some of the things that I've heard other stakeholders raise. But that said, if voting is set up in a very fair, balanced way, we have the right level of granularity with the sectors. We have a fair weighting for each sector, so one sector doesn't outweigh the other. And we have a good framework for collaborating within the sectors. Like if we strive towards those best principles, which are underlying assumptions for what I'm going to share next, then I think voting is a really important part of a healthy stakeholder process. What the concern that I raised in the beginning of this meeting about processes being manageable and actually able to engage is really important, because my experience, CAISO and PJM, is that voting, there's different kinds of workloads. So when the CAISO process, there's less incentives for compromise, but you have a lot of stakeholder comments. So there's a lot of filing. So there's a lot of drafting. A lot of time is involved in filing. A lot of time is involved in lobbying the staff and the leadership. On the flip side, you have PJM, which is sector-based, voting-based, where you first have to come up through the stakeholder process and get buy-in from your peers. You don't submit comments. So there's not drafting, review, vetting inside your organization for that. You really are focusing on the substance, and you're working on substance with staff and with your peers to come up with how can we compromise? What are our options? How can we tweak them to accommodate other people's concerns in order to gain momentum and kind of come towards a consensus that can win a vote, right? So you're all driving towards that. If you remove the voting, there's no tangible incentive for coming together and finding that compromise. At least that's my experience. And so I just wanted to advocate for voting and explain why I value it. I think it makes, my personal preference, I would prefer as a stakeholder to spend more of my time building consensus and understanding my peers rather than developing comments. However, the way CAISO system's set up, I'm not able to collaborate and spend as much time with my peers as I would wish coming to those common understandings because I'm having to submit comments all the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. I appreciate you sharing your perspective as well as not just a yes, no on voting, but your detailed reasons for why yes or no, and invite anyone else to do the same. I don't see any hands. Oh, I do see a hand raised. Never mind. Let's see. Natalie, I'll have you go. And then I'd also like to invite anyone from our large consumer sector or our public interest sector to offer their commentary as well. Go ahead, Natalie.
Thanks. Natalie McIntyre again with NRDC. I wanted to offer a couple thoughts about voting if there is voting. I'm not necessarily going to take a position here about whether there should be, whether it should be advisory or binding. But if there is voting, I think it's really important that you spend a fair amount of time thinking about the balance of those votes. I think different regions across the country have different ways that they weight voting based on sectors. And you want to really make sure that that voting is reasonably balanced so that no one sector has control over the outcome of those votes. The other thing that I wanted to add is that depending on how voting happens throughout the process, it's important that all parties or all sectors have an opportunity to participate in those votes. And I'm going to give a specific example within the SPP East stakeholder process. Within the subgroups where a lot of the work gets done before policies make it up to higher level committees, the votes that happen in those lower level committees are very important, and not all sectors are represented in those votes. And I think that is a downside to that voting process. So just arguing for balance and open opportunities for all perspectives in terms of voting. Thanks.
Thanks, Natalie. And I heard you touch on committee structure a little bit, and just a note that we'll have an opportunity to discuss that in this time today as well. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Joe Fina with the Snohomish County PUD in Washington State. I agree with the last two commenters. I'll just also add, I think voting is good for the stakeholder process. It kind of forces people to think about things and to share, where things are, and it's kind of like an iterative process, so it was from the subcommittee to the committee or what have you, and it goes up. It kind of builds on itself, I think, and it forces people to do that. The other thing, as I'm hearing other people chime in here, with regard to the independent board, I think it's also important as to what tone the board sets for the stakeholder process. If the board is of the mind that consensus is going to be really important, and they're not going to like proposals that are coming up to them that are split 60-40, and they're gonna shoot it back down for the committees to work on more. I think that's another element there that should be considered, and perhaps we can think if that's where we want to go, how to kind of implement that at that higher level. So thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Nora?
Thank you, Nora Sheriff for CLECA, California Large Energy Consumers Association. We represent large industrial customers in California. I really agreed with what Kathleen said, and CLECA engaged in the RIF process with, trying to gather consensus, get votes for the CAISO policy roadmap this year. I think that was a new process that was set up to have all the different sectors vote on which policy initiatives should be included in that roadmap. And it was an interesting combination of written work that then led to that building of consensus with your peers and then across sectors, because you had to write up the proposal initially. So I thought that was a very good process, because I do agree that sometimes if you're just focusing on drafting comments, responding to a proposal, drafting comments, it is perhaps less effective versus what is done in PJM, from what I understand, where you're building on the substance, working with staff and working with peers. And CLECA has consistently said for years now that it is very important for consumer advocates to have a separate vote. And we've also said that vote should be a real vote rather than just an advisory position. And we're reflecting on that. But I just wanted to share what historically our position has been. We need a vote, and we need that vote to be an actual vote, not just a voice that can be disregarded. And I also agree with the fair balancing of all the sectors. It should be equal. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Nora. Let's see. Do we have anyone from consumer advocates that would like to share their perspectives on voting?
Hi, this is Michelle Beck. I represent Utah Office of Consumer Services, and I represent consumer advocates on the launch committee. And I would just like to say that we don't well-formed consensus view yet from the consumer advocates. When I say consumer advocates in this context, I mean the state designated consumer advocates. It is something we're talking about, and I will just say that that we agree with some of the speakers to date. And I don't want to name names because I'll get them wrong. I wasn't taking good notes as to who said what, but I think we definitely agree that consumers need a separate voice from the PIOs, which is not to say that we don't enjoy trying to collaborate with them, but our differences are just a little too distinct. And I think we also tend to agree with those who are talking about finding kind of a middle ground in terms of having, something that's not all the way like the Eastern ISOs, where we've got a very, very prescriptive voting structure and the committees, et cetera, but rather something that might be more limited, more indicative, but that can help to clearly communicate the variety of positions and generally kind of what types of sectors are in each. And then somebody else, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who, talked about making sure we don't set it up so that some voices are completely drowned out. We agree with that as well. So trying to be helpful, and I'm gonna have to drop off the call soon, but we're still in the process of formulating, and you know, I'm hopeful that we can have something so that we can provide decent comments after this.
Thanks, Michelle. And yes, there will be an opportunity to provide written comments on this after the workshop. Karinia.
Thank you. Just sorry, just trying to get my video on. I think there was a lot of comment in the Karinia Cusick Center for Renewables Integration. There's a lot of comments in the last meeting about some struggles with sort of the CAISO process, about sort of things sort of dying, sort of, lack of transparency and sort of, so I think that there's a lot of value, in hearing that concern raised repetitively in the last meeting. There's a lot of value in voting in driving accountability, because the fact that you sort of at some point you've got to drive it to a vote, and versus just sort of things just sort of being able to sort of disappear and die. So I think with regards to there's a ton of value. So, in short, I think, all stakeholder processes that I've been involved with that have been effective have included some kind of voting. I'm trying to sort of think of examples where there has been no voting, and those have been somewhat frustrating processes. They've been sort of long, very engaged, and then, sort of nothing comes out of it. So there's a ton of value of voting to driving accountability. In the comment, just a suggestion for sort of picking sort of the best from different ideas. One of the challenges about voting is the fact that it can be pretty hard, especially if you're doing sector weighted voting, to figure out like what's everybody's position going to be. So if you're trying to drive to consensus, especially across sectors, that can be an exhausting process. And indicative voting, sort of non-binding indicative voting with sort of some transparency on who's voting, who, a preliminary vote could give you an idea of who to reach out to work through any concerns. So I think that there's an opportunity there, and I don't know of any ISO that does that. There might be an opportunity there to sort of streamline the ISO, the voting process, by providing indicative voting sort of first, to help it, communication and collaboration, followed up by some sort of, later binding voting, so that, you as a stakeholder participant, you had some idea of like, who do I really need to talk to understand what their concerns are with this issue, and what collaboration is needed in order to make this issue more successful. So just a thought.
Thank you, Karinia. In the context of, yes, maybe there should be some voting, I've heard a lot of comments on indicative versus advisory. I haven't heard too many comments about what sorts of topics or issues might deserve voting versus ones that maybe don't need voting. Wondering if anyone on the call has comments on that. Kathleen.
Having technical difficulties. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so sorry about that. Kathleen from Vistra. I wanted to maybe use your question to differentiate between polling at a very low level versus voting on proposals. So I've heard of some of what to vote on and what not to vote on, and there's a kind of a different view of kind of vote on everything and but give it different levels of impact, right? So when I was on the task force is at PJM, that's like the lowest, like think of that as the bottom of the tier, right? Very bottom. The voting at that level isn't necessary, even if it's on a package or an option, a proposal, it's not a formal vote. It was basically a way to identify and whittle down to what would be promoted to an upper committee, to the middle committee for a vote there before promoted to the main advisory board. But the reason I wanted to raise this, Mia, is because they at the task force level, they would use polling all the time, not just on the options of the proposal, but on policy questions. And then you could see where the task force members, which was much smaller, you did actually have a better sense of who was voting at that level, where they went on like main policy questions that informed the proposals. And for my part, I found that very useful. So just a plug for, there's lots of ways to vote, and sometimes it's polling more than it is voting. And I'm curious if others have thoughts.
Thanks, Kathleen, for expanding the question. Let's see, invite one or two more comments on voting, and then I am going to move us to our final question of today. Joe, I see your hand raised. Is that a holdover from before? Or did you have another comment to share? Okay, not hearing anything from Joe. Mike, go ahead. Mike Florio, go ahead with your comment.
Yeah, sorry, unmuted. I put a comment in the chat and Pam asked me to speak to it. What I was suggesting is that, voting may be important to identify the views of specific sectors, but I would suggest that it's the role of the board to weigh the views of different sectors on an issue-by-issue basis, rather than assigning arbitrary weights to different sectors that would apply across the board to all kinds of issues. There may be issues that just aren't that important to certain sectors, whereas other issues are very important to them, and trying to assign uniform weights across the board just seems overly rigid and counterproductive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. All right, we'll have our last two live comments from Kamaya and Mona, and then we'll move on to our next question. Kamaya, go ahead.
Hi, Kimaya Abreu from Voltus. We're a demand response provider and DER aggregator. I wanted to follow up on Karinia's comment and Kathleen Colbert's about indicative voting, and Kathleen mentioned polling as an alternative. And I just wanted to support the idea that there are some issues or perhaps moments in the process where indicative voting or a sort of temperature check can be very valuable with a recording of what everybody's temperature is on an issue. And then there are points in a process where a binding vote or something that has a little bit more weight can actually drive either consensus or speed up speed up the process to an actual outcome. But for that indicative voting, that polling, just wanted to mention that there are options beyond a binary vote, yes, no, like we had today with the sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that can give an indication of which parties are, less on board with the particular issue. And then I just heard something Mike said that I appreciated in terms of thinking about weighting of sectors. Someone mentioned earlier an equal weighting of various sectors, and I just wanted to mention that to me it seems important to understand clearly what criteria are being used to weight various sectors, because it's something like an equal vote across all sectors could be somewhat arbitrary depending on, you know, what interests and number of groups, for instance, are involved in different sectors. So I'm definitely very curious about what are the goals or considerations behind the weighting.
Thanks, Kamaya. Let's see, and I think it was Mona had their hand up. Mona, did you still want to share something?
Yeah, I think the comments that I was going to make have largely been reflected by the comments of Kamaya and others that commented ahead of me. I just wanted to say that in other RTOs and ISOs that I participate in, the voting is helpful, particularly when you have a hierarchy of working groups moving up the chain to a board vote. That indicates the support that any particular initiative has. So that's helpful in advancing issues within an RTO organization. But I did just want to comment that those that are voting at some of the initial levels of that process may not have broad sector representation, something that you're hearing over and over again. So that indication of support may be from a limited group of market participants that doesn't have the broad interests of the participants, or is not reflecting that broad market participation. And some of it is just because bandwidth limitations that have also been mentioned previously. So just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. All right, with that, I'm going to move us to our final question of the day regarding standing and ad hoc committees. So the question here is, what sort of forums or committees do sectors use to organize themselves? And I know we didn't get too much of an opportunity to hear from the launch committee members on this, but welcome any reflections folks have on this question. Particularly welcome specific ideas for the stakeholder process work group to consider as they work to draft a straw proposal. And as with our previous questions, if you'd prefer to share your comment in the chat, that's fine. You can also share your comments anonymously on Slido. Details are here on the slide, and I'll put them in the chat as well. Given that our launch committee and stakeholder process work group members didn't have too much of an opportunity to answer this question during the panel, I'd also welcome you to seed the conversation now. So I think we had Ian and Allie and oh gosh, I'm already blanking on who all was on our panel, but if any of y'all have comments you'd like to share.
I think one of the questions that we had teed up for the panel, and apologies for running out of time, I think we had a really good dialogue on some of the these topics, and I think it's clear from the dialogue and engagement on this call that these are very meaty topics. But one of the questions that we had is there's a couple different ways that sectors have been organizing themselves, and what are some of those values around sector organization? I think to date, we've had some sectors who organize themselves kind of on an ad hoc basis. There's a number of sectors that have pretty comprehensive trade associations that are able to facilitate sector coordination to a pretty great extent. And then we had the IPP sector in the Regional Issues Forum as the only sector who had noticed calls that were sector-based for the Regional Issues Forum and facilitated and noticed through the CAISO process. So trying to really suss out some of the values and differences between how sectors organize, how and how transparent that organization needs to be and how formal that organization needs to be. I think we've seen some benefits of informal organization, but also some pretty strong criticisms of informal organization through this process. So would really appreciate especially those members or stakeholders who have been critical of informal organization or closed door organization to share some of that perspective so that we can really understand not just how sectors engage when they come together, but how sectors, how formal the organization of sectors on their own needs to be. And maybe I'll just add one more thought that I've heard consistently from RIF liaisons, and I think we have a number of those on this call, is just how hard it is to be the organizer of a sector, that the responsibility of organizing and creating sector distribution lists and membership rosters is very administrative and very challenging. And so how do we improve upon that organizational structure that allows, I think, the fluidity that we've heard a number of market participants state that they value, that they can, you know, move in and out of stakeholder initiatives based on their interest and engagement, but also support our sector leaders or volunteer sector leaders in being able to comprehensively communicate with their sectors in a way that feels inclusive. So I was hoping that that would, you know, maybe spark a couple hands to go up, but I hope we can get a couple people to chime in on some of these thoughts.
Thank you, Pam, for that added context. It looks like you at least sparked something from Vijay.
Thank you. This is something I was going to raise at some point. To learn from the experience in the current CalISO structure, there is and I'm giving my sector as an example. So I agree with Pam, but I want to elaborate on something Pam has brought up, is that the PIO sector, for example, has 9 topics of interest, but 3 of them they may suddenly get involved, and otherwise they may not be involved. That doesn't mean they're not engaged. And so I've had to take some interesting remarks from some other sectors at times, is we don't hear much from the PIO sector or what do they need. So it has been my job, and I have tried my best, that I'm not personalizing this experience. It is that it's very hard for liaisons to get the views of the sector representatives or get everybody's input organized or documented. So, which is why I think somebody on the panel at the beginning said that there should be an open door approach to these forums or whatever this advisory group will be, where if one of my PIO sector members did not have a chance to respond to me, can still come up to that open forum and share their concerns or thoughts. So this is a balancing act and a tricky one to manage, but consistency of sector engagement is definitely valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. Natalie, I saw you share some comments in the chat, and if you're comfortable, I welcome you to share them out loud because I think it does add some, it's a nice example for folks to react to.
Sure. Thanks, Natalie McIntyre, NRDC. I have been a participant in the MISO environmental sector for quite a long time. At points, I have been our representative on the Planning Advisory Committee and have led some of the forums that we have. And it's really, I mean, over the time that I've participated, it's been sort of an evolution of how we coordinate and work together. But we, at this point, have a variety of regular calls. Some of them are sort of monthly, fairly high-level calls where we're coordinating on a variety of issues across MISO and updating the larger group who may or may not be participating in every meeting like some of us do. And some of those meetings on a regular basis are really focused on our specific advocacy in stakeholder forums, you know, the individual stakeholder forums within MISO. For example, you know, we have regular meetings to plan for our work in the transmission advocacy space or transmission planning space. We have regular calls to coordinate around our advocacy on resource adequacy issues. And the other thing that I noted there is that as a sector, we also are building relationships with other sectors. And so on a more ad hoc basis, we do have calls with other sectors to coordinate, to understand their positions on issues, to work on things together where we have alignment and where we have differences, sometimes just to better understand each other. So just some examples.
Thank you, Natalie, for sharing. We have just a few minutes left, so I'll take a last one or two comments before I move us into closing. Margaret.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I wanted to weigh in on the questions that Pam had raised regarding whether there would be value in perhaps putting some structure around sector activities. And one of the observations that I have from the RIF is that there's a good deal of variation in the degree of formality that each sector seems to use to coordinate their positions and convey their interests up through the RIF process. I will say that more formal structure would seem to have value, you know, just to provide maybe more opportunities or more sort of organized opportunities for sector members to weigh in. It's something that I've talked about with my co-liaison for the PTO sector, for example. But at the same time, I think imposing more structure and organization on a sector's activities places a different resource burden on the RIF liaisons. And I think there has to be a greater degree of commitment among sector participants to engage with the business of the sector so that sector activities are not something that the liaison or the representative performs for that sector. So I think there's a little bit of a give and take. If you put more organization around a sector's activities, I think the trade-off needs to be perhaps a greater level of commitment from individual sector members to engage with the process.
Thanks for your comments. Tony, I'll let you close us out.
Well, I'm not sure my comment is well suited to do that, but this last thing really caught my eye. I'd say the logistics of sector organization for a liaison or a representative in these is one of the main challenges, certainly a weak point of mine personally, as I think back on what I could have done better. And so I think whether that's coming from the RO as far as just organizational tools or something else that can help the sectors do their jobs, I think would be really strengthen the process. Not sure exactly the form of that, but I think the logistical challenge should not be underestimated.
Thanks, Tony. All right, with that, I'm going to move us into our closing. And part of our closing is that this is not your last opportunity to provide input on these questions. So GridWorks will take everything that y'all have shared in workshops 1, 2, and 3, put that into some sort of summary document that will help to inform the stakeholder process work group in developing a straw proposal for stakeholder engagement, as well as any additional comments that you have that you didn't get an opportunity to share during workshops 1, 2, and 3, ideas that came to you after workshops 1, 2, and 3. So you have an opportunity to submit comments to the launch committee and stakeholder process work group. Sorry, that's a mouthful. By August 16th. The template with all the questions is up on the Weeb website. And I think one thing we've heard today is how much we all love researching and writing comments. And so welcome you to collaborate with others to submit joint comments. And I think my last reflection on our conversations in workshops 1, 2, and 3, I feel like we've had a lot of good sort of high-level discussion about what you all want from the stakeholder engagement process from the RO in terms of like values and challenges that you've had with it. But I really encourage you in submitting your comments to get specific about what sort of ideas or structures or what specifically a process might look like that would work for you. And we have, as I mentioned, a little bit of a break before we see each other again. Our next workshop is on August 28th. And we will be spending that time reviewing the draft stakeholder engagement straw proposal, as well as taking feedback and comment on that. Kathleen, Pam, I believe you had a couple closing remarks you wanted to make.
Thanks, Neha. And I just, again, want to thank everybody for providing all of their comments and ideas and issues and questions and all of the pieces today. I think this is exactly what we're hoping to get out of these workshops. So thank you all for participating, and thanks in advance for putting in the time to submit the comments. One of the things I just wanted to mention, and this came up in a couple of different contexts, I think, over the course of today, and even in our first 2 workshops, that some of these issues are things that we're having some conversations about in some of our other workshops. We have already had a workshop for RO governance and formation. The slides from that workshop and even a recording of that workshop are on the website. So if you were unable to attend that workshop and you want to know what we talked about and how that might overlap with some of the things that we've talked about here, please do take a look at that. We have coming up next week our CAISO issues and tariff workshop on Monday. There will be some of this in there, a little bit, but then the big one, I think, that is probably most related to this is our public interest workshop. We had that originally scheduled for this week, and we pushed it out because we needed a little more time, I think, to pull together some structure to have a really productive conversation. So that is now scheduled for the afternoon of August 15th. We'll be spending a lot of time in that conversation talking about the role of the state's committee and sort of thinking about the way the BOSSR works now and kind of what we envision that role continuing to be, as well as the consumer advocates role and some discussion about public interest, or I'm sorry, public power and consumer-owned utilities. So I just wanted to flag that we are really trying to ensure that these conversations are being integrated between our work groups. But if there are issues within those topics that you want to ensure that we are incorporating, please go ahead and include them in these comments. I think it will be helpful to get those ideas and thoughts as we go in real time. So I just wanted to just sort of flag that while we are certainly having a lot of conversations in kind of silos through these work groups, that there is a very concerted effort in the launch committee to ensure that those work groups are overlapping and integrating, and that the topics are being pulled together when there is overlap. This stakeholder process affects everything else, and so your feedback is incredibly valuable, and just really appreciate again all the thoughtful input that we've received, and look forward to continuing this conversation. And I don't know, Pam, if you wanted to say anything at the end, but just just expressing thanks on behalf of the launch committee.
I also appreciate, I'll echo Kathleen's thanks, and I really appreciate the robust dialogue that we've had through these workshops. Appreciate GridWorks' support in facilitating that dialogue. We've needed all the help and support we can get to really ensure that we're getting as many different perspectives into this process as possible. Looking forward to your comments. I really do encourage, I know we have a lot more people on this call and a lot more perspectives than we can get to even in our extended work groups. So I really encourage everyone to submit comments with the kind of detail that Kathleen pointed to, so that I think we can move forward with a recommendation package in the fall.
Thanks, Pam. Thanks, Kathleen. Apologies for going a few minutes over. With that, we'll let you go, and I hope you have a good weekend. We'll see you at the end of the month.
Thanks, everybody.